Well, welcome to More to the Story with Molly White. I'm so glad you joined me again today for another great discussion. And I can't wait to introduce our special guest today. And listen, I want you to be sure and like this, share it with all your friends. We need to get this important information out there. And it's about abortion and breast cancer. And so we're going to really dive into that subject with an expert today. But before I do, I just want to welcome my awesome, wonderful co-host, Mary Browning. Hey, Mary.
Thank you, Molly. It's so good to be part of the show again today, and I am looking forward to what our guest has to say.
Well, I actually met Dr. Joel Brind just years ago. We have worked a lot together at the United Nations during the Commission on the Status of Women conference when he and another leading expert in breast cancer would come in and put on either side events or speak at parallel events and educate women from all over the world about breast cancer, what causes breast cancer prevention, and the research that he has found linking abortion to breast cancer. So welcome, Dr. Joel Brind.
Oh, it's great to be here with you again, Molly. Thanks for having me on.
Well, sure. And I can read your incredible bio, but why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself, talk to us a little bit about your background, and then we'll just dive into the abortion breast cancer research.
Well, okay. My training is pretty much mainstream as a scientist. I always wanted to be a scientist and cure cancer and so on and so I decided to be a scientist and professor and all that back in 1961 when I was 10 years old, so 10 years later, I got my bachelor's degree from Yale, and 10 years after that, I got my PhD from NYU in basic medical sciences with a major in biochemistry and minor in immunology and physiology. And largely, my research then involved work on sex steroid hormones, which include estrogens, of course. And estrogens are implicated in most of the risk factors for breast cancer. So my work was tangentially associated with breast cancer there, looking at levels of estrogens, estrogen precursors, estrogen metabolites in the blood, and whether or not they were related to the incidence of breast cancer. And so the last time I had been involved in that was 1982, when I wrote a grant proposal, which it wasn't funded, but it was to look at one of the estrogen precursors in breast cancer. And then I went on to other things, other steroids and other areas of work in my research. And then I was in 1986. Actually, I was hired as a professor. Started as an assistant professor, but basically a full-time professor at Baruch College of the City University of New York, where I taught for 34 years before I retired. It was the year I was turning 70. It was also the COVID year, so it was, teaching was not the same, and it wasn't really working too well remotely because the students cheated like crazy. But anyway. That was a little bit disheartening.
When the cat's away, the mice will play, huh?
Well, it's a little disheartening to see, A, that they don't have the moral backbone to avoid cheating, and B, that they don't even have the sort of, tactical intelligence to realize how easy it is to catch them. But anyway, I came across the association between abortion and breast cancer in 1992. Actually, it was 91 when I had attended some conferences on RU486 and other antiprogestins, other drugs which are antiprogesterone drugs, which of course are the abortion pills. And I had done some research on them, and I got introduced to my local pro-life organization when I was living in northern New Jersey. And I was interested in helping out actually in 91. And they said, well, you can contribute with your background and your expertise and whatnot. I'm sure you can contribute to the movement in something a little better than getting your head bashed in at a clinic protest. And I said, okay. And I prayed about it. What is it that my background and my skills and my expertise would render me suitable for in terms of helping the pro-life movement? And I came across an article. This was about 3 months later. So now this was 1992, and I remember it was the October 31st, 1992 issue of Science News, which is it's a lay publication, but most scientists actually subscribe to it, and it's a weekly summary. Now I think it's biweekly. I think it's only online now, where you it gives you some articles, some full length, some snippets of science, every field of science from all around the world. So it keeps you abreast of what's going on in the sciences in general. Well, on October 31st of 1992, that day for that issue just happened to coincide with Halloween, of course. So the editors thought it would be very cute to have a cover which featured a woman about 9.5 months pregnant, black on a sunset, a big sunset, so it was all orange and black in silhouette. And the two feature articles for that issue of Science News were monster black holes, right? It's Halloween themed there, of course, and motherhood and breast cancer. So they knew, because the premise was, yes, we have known for quite a few years that pregnancy protects against breast cancer, but they want to update and find out why and all of this and that. And I read the article and I noticed something strange about the article, and that is it kept talking about how pregnancy protects women against breast cancer, but it didn't say it had to be a full-term pregnancy. And I remember the classical study that was published in 1970 under the auspices of the World Health Organization, when it meant something in those days, under the directorship of Dr. Brian McMahon, a very first-class epidemiologist at Harvard, when that meant something once upon a time. And they looked at pregnancy and breast cancer around the world. They did a multi-center, 7 countries, a study around the world study on pregnancy and breast cancer, and they found that they couldn't really find any significant consistent associations between pregnancy and breast cancer. And then what they did is they restricted their study, and they said, okay, let's just look at full-term pregnancy and not aborted pregnancies, which in those days, most of the aborted pregnancies were late-term or middle-term miscarriages, not abortions. But still, they don't confer the protective effect. So they noticed then that if they deleted the pregnancies that didn't go to term and they just looked at first term, they found out that it wasn't so much having the pregnancy. It was having a full-term pregnancy, and B, how old you were when you had your first one. So they established very well at that time the well-known risk factor of age at first-term pregnancy. And it has to be a full-term pregnancy, and the risk of breast cancer. If you have a first-term pregnancy, the younger you are, the lower your risk of breast cancer. The longer you wait before you have your first-term pregnancy, the higher your risk of breast cancer. Now, that tells you just do the math, okay, so abortion, they don't confer protection. So you give up that protection, so your risk goes up. So just in that way, without doing anything else, without implicating abortion itself, they say, so abortion is a risk factor, but they still manage to, well, no, it's not really a risk factor, because you see, it's not the abortion. It's the termination. It's not the abortion. It's the termination of the pregnancy. I mean, you've never seen such wonderful examples of quotes of double talk.
And word salad. Yeah.
Word salad, double talk. But the thing is, of course, abortion is largely aimed at young women who have not had a child yet. So for young childless women, they are necessarily, every single time that a woman who aborts her first pregnancy is increasing her risk of breast cancer by foregoing the protection that carrying that pregnancy to term would have provided. So there's that so-called that effect of lack of full-term pregnancy. And then it turns out there is a direct effect also. If you have an induced abortion, not a spontaneous abortion, but in addition to that loss of protection, you actually increase the risk. There's something about abortion, about abrogating that first-term pregnancy, that really independently, so we call that the independent risk factor. As an independent risk factor, abortion increases the risk. So that's what I noticed was that in that article about pregnancy and breast cancer, they hadn't quoted that, and they never mentioned that the pregnancy had to be a term pregnancy. That prompted me to go back to the library where I had last been 10 years prior in 1982. And by 1992, there were enough studies around in the literature that convinced me that independent of that effect in delaying a first-term pregnancy, induced abortion, what we call abortion generally, but induced abortion increases the risk of breast cancer independently. And the second thing that told me what I needed to do was the fact that if it were anything else showing the kind of consistent increase in risk that abortion had, it would be news everywhere. It would be crazy. It would be all over the place. It
Right.
would be on everybody's lips, that this increases the risk of breast cancer. So I found out, so I put together all the literature, and after a while, I gathered a few colleagues. I started talking about it and writing about it and talking to legislators about it. And at the time, I was living in Pennsylvania also, and my local legislator was on the committee, and I got on the committee that was chaired by Joe Pitts, whom you may know, became a very staunch pro-life advocate as a congressman from Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. And he got me a small grant, a couple $1,000, so we could review the existing literature. And we came out with our comprehensive quantitative review and meta-analysis, a study of studies in 1996. And it made a big splash before anybody knew what hit them. And then of course, it's been covered up with all kinds of phony, fraudulent studies, and now everybody's learning how Dr. Fauci, the terrible Dr. Fauci, how he lied to us about everything, which he did, of course, but it was not just him. That's the system. The system, I mean, the people in the National Cancer Institute, those wonderful people who were trying to cure cancer. No, they're not. Yeah. Those people have caused more cancer than they've ever cured. That's for sure. Because they have actively covered up this link between abortion and breast cancer, even when some of their own studies have demonstrated it. Yeah. And this is just what did Mark Twain say? 3 ways to lie. You have lies, damnable lies, and statistics. Yeah. So when you're an epidemiologist now, and you are the guardian of the great secrets of these brilliant minds who have MPHs and they do epidemiology, you have to believe what they say. And, but when they come up with a study that they want to falsify the data, boy, there's so many ways to do it. And essentially, my career from about 1992 till about 2008, 2010, so we're talking about 15 to 20 years, was studying the link between abortion and breast cancer. But more than half of that time, and a lot of the time since, has been devoted to studying the cover-up of the abortion breast cancer link. It's a study in and of itself to see how whenever a study comes out that shows, no, there's no connection between abortion and breast cancer, or that it actually looks like it's protective. I used to say I'd print out the study and let it sit around at room temperature for a few days, and then it would start to stink, And I would just mull over it, just sort of meditate on what they did and how they did it. And that's how they covered it up. And I kind of made a career of it. I mean, I did the pro-life circuit. I used to speak at pro-life gatherings, annual meetings, and so on. And before long, it was quite a tall order to edit down what I had to say to a very, very few stories that the audience would be most interested in, instead of detailing every single major study that came out. The last study that came out was in 2018, the last major study in 2018. The National Academy of Science and Medicine came out with a big white paper. The abortion breast cancer is baloney. Abortion is safe, safe, safe. And in that part about breast cancer, they cited only 3 studies. 4, actually. 1 was about abortion of breast. 3 were about abortion of breast cancer itself. 1 was a study about methods which are related to it. And all of them were fraudulent. Not only were all of those studies fraudulent, but I had personally authored rebuttals that were published in the peer-reviewed literature about each of those studies. My disproofs, my rebuttals were already there. Of course, those are completely ignored, even by, unfortunately, people in the pro-life movement, because, the chorus of denial that comes from the highest places was able to influence donors and so on. You hear something is wrong with this link, something's wrong with me, something's wrong with my science. Look how they beat up on RFK Jr. for so many years.
Yeah,
I mean,
they don't like to get uncovered. They don't like to get exposed.
Yeah, so watch out for the official experts. So what I'm telling everybody now is that, in case you didn't know, it's not just COVID, it's not just Fauci. It's in this particular instance, it's most notoriously the National Cancer Institute, the U.S. National Cancer Institute, funded by your tax dollars, which has been most assiduous in covering up the abortion breast cancer link. Other agencies also. The biggest study to cover it up was a study that came out in 1997 in Denmark, and it was all Danish women. It was such a big study, 1.5 million women, every woman born in the state of Denmark between 1935 and 1992. Oh boy, the data is so strong, so wonderful. What a convincing study. And the risk increase with abortion, the risk increase for breast cancer was exactly zero. No connection at all. Well, that's what it is. So that study was also funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, interestingly enough.
Wow.
Came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, which, as doctors who may be listening, you probably know it as the gospel according to the New England Journal of Medicine. Because they, again, it's believed as gospel. These are scientists. These are like saints or prophets or whatever. And a lot of them are just, they're dishonest technocrats who are just concerned with their own money and their own political power and their own political agenda. And we lavish them with billions of dollars in taxpayer funding.
And then
Dr. Brind,
they leave women
Women?
not breast cancer.
Well, women. Oh, yeah. Well,
Paying
who
the
cares about
price,
them? They're just women,
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We love women. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they're
Well, I know
all these
Mary-
women's groups. Yeah, they love women so much. Do you know, we published our comprehensive, our systematic review and meta-analysis back in 1996. Well, we did another one, Dr. Len Franchi and I at the Breast Cancer Prevention Institute, which we co-founded in 1999. We still work together a lot. So we published one on abortion and breast cancer in South Asia, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, right? Bangladesh, South Asian women. Why do we do it in South Asian women? Well, because, abortion's kind of been exported that way. And now a number of years had passed and there was some good data available. In fact, the data was so good that we found there were about 20 studies and almost every single one of them showed a significant increase. So we put it together in a meta-analysis and we found that the relative risk, instead of being about 1.3, as we had found in our earlier review and meta-analysis, instead of 1.3, which means a 30% increase in the risk of breast cancer if you've had an abortion. Instead of a 30% increase, this was 150% increase. Wow, that sounds amazing on the one hand. On the other hand, it says, wait a minute, why should it have one effect on one side of the world and a completely different effect on the other side of the world, a different magnitude? Well, it isn't really. That's because it's relative risk. So the relative risk is 30% higher in the West, in the industrialized world, to get breast cancer if you've had an abortion. In India, Pakistan, right, South Asia, it's 150% more. Why? Well, what's the baseline risk? In the West, it's about 10%. Even without abortion, you still got about a 10% lifetime risk of breast cancer. So if it goes up by 30%, that's 13%. Well, in India, typically the risk for breast cancer is only about 2%. So if it goes up by 150%, it goes up to 5%, 2% plus 3. So there's an absolute increase of about 3%. East, west, north, south, wherever you are, women are women, right?
Wow.
Yes.
Endocrinologically and health-wise and all of that. So the reason, so it's a higher magnitude, right? A 2.5 relative risk is a lot easier to demonstrate statistically. It's a stronger statistic. Why? Because those are good places to study abortion and breast cancer. If you study abortion and breast cancer in the U.S. or in the industrialized world anywhere, you got all kinds of things influencing breast cancer risk, from alcohol to not having children early, to not having that many children, to not breastfeeding your children, right? So you go to India, and traditionally in India, it's getting less and less so now as they become more modernized. But if you go traditionally to India, Pakistan, and so on, you take the typical girl, when she gets married when she's a teenager, 15, 16, right? She starts having kids right away, has a lot of them, breastfeeds all of them, doesn't smoke, doesn't drink. What's there to give her breast cancer? Well, birth control pills. That showed up because they're doing that along with abortion for a couple of decades now out there. Birth control pills and abortion. That's about it. So the fewer factors that you have that influence the disease you're looking at, the more virgin the population is with regard to that exposure, in this case, at least abortion, the better they are to statistically study it. I mean, people came up to me in the early days of my research. They said, wow, why don't you study it in Russia or China? You got so many abortions there. What a great place to study abortion and breast cancer. No, actually, it isn't. That's one of the ways the risk is covered up. In recent Chinese studies, they can actually say, oh, wait, the risk is, if anything, it's a protective factor. And it certainly doesn't seem to be any risk. Why not? Because the average woman that you're comparing to has had an abortion. Instead of the typical woman with abortion versus without abortion, now the typical woman without abortion doesn't exist because the woman without an abortion is not typical. most women have had abortions.
Wow.
And once you get to the point where a majority of the population have had abortions, who is it who doesn't have abortions? Typically, I'm sorry, I have to shut my phone off here because it's...
So that is interesting because it speaks to at least in China, they had the one-child policy. So a lot of people with abortions.
Yes.
Yeah.
So who are the women who don't have abortions? Right? They're the ones who they may be subfertile or infertile. They started having children late, or they don't have any children. These are big. Not having any children is a big risk factor for breast cancer. Or starting when you're 30 instead of when you're 20 is a big risk factor for breast cancer. So the typical woman without an abortion was now in this increased risk category. So when you compare to her, well, sure, it looks protective because, hey, you know what? You probably have a lower risk of breast cancer. If you had 3 or 4 children and then you had a couple of abortions because that's all you wanted in your 30s, you probably have a lower risk of breast cancer than a woman who had an abortion and never got pregnant again.
Yeah.
You see? So this is how the numbers work. So it's a very tricky thing. And it's one of the ways, as I say, that the link has been covered up. There are a couple of studies from Serbia, Yugoslavia, and China more recently, where the typical population, has already had an abortion. This shows up now in what's called a meta-regression analysis as part of the meta-analysis. And,
So
it
Dr.
gets into
Joel,
the
real
weeds
quick,
and, what's that?
Real quick, I want to ask you a question. I've got several of them written here. So in China, the breast cancer, has it increased in women in China through?
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, the U.S. National Cancer Institute published a paper in 2008 that says China is on the cusp of a breast cancer epidemic. But we don't know why. It's all modern things, air pollution, global warming, fewer children, you name it, right? Anything but abortion.
Anything but. And so can you explain to our audience what the factors that would increase a woman's chance of getting breast cancer? What, if she has an induced abortion, which I want to say induced.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Why is it that an induced abortion does? Yeah. Well, the reason is, well, I'll tell you, most spontaneous abortions, miscarriages, happen very early. And they happen because the estrogen and progesterone, the 2 key hormones that maintain that pregnancy, that establish and maintain the pregnancy, they don't quite get going because there's a handoff. The baton is passed from mother to child with the hormones because her ovaries produce these hormones. And actually, from the time of conception, the child produces the hormones, until a placenta is established. And between that time that the child starts producing the hormones in the follicle before it ovulates, and then the child starts producing it again through its own placenta that it establishes, the ovaries have to take over. So for about the first trimester, it's ovarian hormones. And then when the placenta needs to get established and start making its own, right around that time, what we call the peri-implantational period, something goes wrong in most miscarriages. And maybe there's something genetically wrong with the child's genetic makeup, with the machinery, usually that's something like that. But for whatever reason, it's before those hormones get cranked up. And when they get cranked up in a normal pregnancy, and that's typically what is aborted in an induced abortion, a normal pregnancy, 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks or later, the hormones are already really, really raging. And when I say raging, I mean from the time of conception to the end of the first trimester, the estrogen and progesterone levels in the mother's blood, for example, go up by 2,000%. They're way higher when every woman knows this. The hormones are way higher when you're pregnant than at any other time. And they don't get cranked. And some women have come up to me sometimes after my talk, and she says, thank you for explaining this to me. Because I knew when I had I got pregnant and then I had a miscarriage, and I knew there was something wrong. There was something different. Didn't feel the same. You didn't feel maybe that breast swelling or tenderness that increases that growth spurt that's now really going on. That growth spurt is what makes the cells in the breast grow so that by the end of the 9 months, by the end of a pregnancy, they'll actually be able to make enough milk to feed a baby. So they start growing right away in a normal pregnancy due to the combined effect of estrogen and progesterone. And that means there are a lot of extra cells being made. And if the pregnancy is aborted, what happens to those cells? They die. Well, that's a lot of cell death. And typically that's accompanied by inflammation. Has to do again with glycine, which is something I've been researching a lot since that you know about. But most people are deficient in glycine. And so all of this cell death is accompanied by inflammation. In fact, every month, the breasts have a little bit of that going on with the natural cycle, a little bit of a growth spurt, and then those cells have to regress. And typically, you know, if you don't get pregnant, if you're deficient in glycine, you're going to get inflammation. So inflammation compared with this, I mean, in conjunction with this spurt of growth stimulating hormones, estrogen and progesterone, you get, more places that cancers can start because you have more of these primitive growing cells in the breast. And they'll stay there. They're not going to get matured unless you have a pregnancy that goes to term or at least to 32 weeks. That seems to be the magic time. That's equivalent to like having a term pregnancy, a pregnancy that goes to 32 weeks. So, example, you even see women, they may have breast cancer, they may have some other reason why the doctor wants to terminate the pregnancy, and then they'll sometimes pick it at 30 weeks or 31 weeks, which is, you should really wait till at least 32 weeks. That's the golden time when the breasts now assume the role of becoming protective against breast cancer. The pregnancy, the child has that role. And even if a child is going to be doomed to a very short life, maybe even hours or days or weeks, the child's accomplished pretty much by decreasing his mom's risk of breast cancer, right? It's already, that baby that may die within hours of birth has already accomplished, something for his or her
something
mom.
Protective, yeah.
And,
so let me ask you this, Dr. Joel. So what I thought I heard you say is that when a pregnancy is terminated, after your breasts are developed, you have a lot of cells, and if that pregnancy is terminated via abortion before 32 weeks, as most of them are,
right? Yeah.
Then these cells are left to die off. You get inflammation, and they're more susceptible to becoming cancerous.
Right. Yes. The cells. Yeah. There are more cells then that are left in the breast that don't die off, and even the ones that do. Between the inflammation and the cell multiplication, the stimulus to multiply cells, that's going to statistically, it's numerically that means there's going to be more breast cancer in women who are in that situation.
And so, did I hear you say something like if a woman had aborted her first pregnancy and then a year or two later got pregnant again, brought that child to birth, raised that child, nursed it, or maybe not nursed it, that going to have a little bit of a reversal?
Absolutely. Well, it will definitely add a protective effect. The way to look at it, I think, is the word factor. We talk about a risk factor and a protective factor. All of these things factor in to breast cancer incidence. There are genetic factors, behavioral factors, dietary factors, and these reproductive risk factors. So, whether you had an abortion, you didn't have an abortion, how old when you had the abortion, how old when you had a full-term pregnancy. It has to do with what we call the term of art used among researchers in breast cancer is called the susceptibility window. Okay. And that is basically the interval between puberty and your first full-term pregnancy. That's when your breasts have now developed to adult size. So they have a lot of primitive cells in them. We call them type 1 lobules, which are vulnerable to carcinogenic change. When I say they're vulnerable to carcinogenic change, it's because if they get zapped by a carcinogen, something changes the genetics that makes them potentially carry a cancer gene, let's say now. They are still cells that are capable of being stimulated to grow, and that's what makes them potentially cancer producing. Once you've had that full-term pregnancy, most of the cells in the breast have that what's called terminal differentiated genetic profile, which means that even if they get zapped by a carcinogen, they're not going to multiply, so they can't give rise to a cancer. So that's the thinking behind most of that.
I want to go back to what you said, something you said early on when you said in 91 and 92, there was evidence that RU486, anti-progesterone basically, right? Is that what you said?
Evidence of what? That
there was a link to cancer.
Oh, no. The RU486, I wasn't told. The link to cancer was just with abortion. I think as far as what's known is that whether it's a chemical abortion or
I gotcha. Okay,
matter.
So back then that there was a link between abortion and cancer.
Yeah, now that was not just 1991 and because when I said between 1982 and 92, I had seen enough evidence that there was there. But in the very first study, and it was a big study, it was a nationwide study in Japan, was published that showed like almost a threefold increase in breast cancer risk among women who had an abortion. That was published in 1957 in the
So
Japanese
that
Journal of
was,
Cancer Research.
so I'm thinking right now then, 92, well, 57 was even further, but
Yeah.
92 was 8 years before the drug abortion was approved in this country. So
Oh, yeah. Right.
as we're waiting for the FDA to determine whether or not the mifepristone is
Well, yes, I testified in 1996, the year that it was actually approved by the FDA. I was there, and you may know Dr. Donna Harrison.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
I actually
Mhm.
sat next to Donna Harrison. That was the day I met her. We
Awesome.
got to we became friends at that time when we found ourselves sitting next to each other at the hearings. This was at the FDA Advisory Committee hearings in 1991. And my testimony, everybody, you could get 3 minutes if you submitted it and jumped through all their hoops, right? So my 3 minutes of testimony was that this would definitely result in many, many cases of breast cancer. And it should certainly not be approved for that reason. I mean, I stuck to my, to the breast cancer as a reason. I mean, there's lots of reasons not to kill people, but, it's,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's one reason that they
Yeah.
might listen to, but they're not interested in it, of course.
Well,
They would rather deny.
yeah. And it's just such mind-boggling and such a shame that they're just willing to let women be harmed, not only by abortion, but by
Well,
the after effects that could be the
that's the
increased
culture.
risk of breast cancer. And they could care less. And I have several other questions for you, but we're about to run out of time. And if you're available, we can do a part 2 because I want to dive a little bit more into it because I have all these questions. Let me see, about the birth control pills, even the
Yeah.
link between abortion and birth control. We haven't even touched on that. And just, you have touched on a lot of the risk factors. It's age,
Right.
it's the age of your first pregnancy, if you carried your pregnancy to term, if you nursed your baby. I think the age you started your menstrual cycle. I think family history, doesn't that all
Yes.
tie into
Oh,
some
yeah.
factors?
Especially the particular genes that have been identified that are well known, the BRCA1 and 2 genes, which are well known to be, associated with increased risk. So those.
Doctor, I wonder if you could speak up. Every now and then your voice kind of trails down and they're hard to hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. I have the microphone kind of off here at the side, but usually that picks it up okay.
And so I think, like Mary said earlier, I think you touched a little bit about, the abortion drugs are anti-progesterone, and that's, they block progesterone, which is what the baby needs to grow and develop. I was wondering, and then of course the baby dies and she has the abortion and all that. And then those risk factors can increase. But if she takes the mifepristone and within, 72 hours, Mary, takes the abortion reversal, would that kind of counteract those risk factors?
Well, sure. Otherwise it wouldn't work. And it does work. And of course, that's another area of denial, misinformation and disinformation. You can't reverse the abortion pill. Yes, you can.
They just don't want
Thousands
those
of babies have been
born.
saved that way.
Yeah.
Yes, because it directly interferes with it's a numbers game. These are hormone. Progesterone is a hormone, and mifepristone is a hormone antagonist. So it competes with the receptors for the hormone, and when it binds to the receptor, it stays there and it inactivates it. Okay, so it doesn't let progesterone bind. So if you then swamp it with real progesterone, a very high concentration of real progesterone, you can dilute out the mifepristone and nullify its effect. And it works. And, as I say, thousands of babies have been saved, although who doesn't want to admit it? Well, the mainstream.
The abortion rights group. Everybody who's for abortion doesn't want to admit it. And it's a shame because they're putting women's lives at risk as far as in killing babies, so the double-edged sword there. So I guess I want maybe to close with, how would you address our audience? How would they get this information if you're interested in breast cancer prevention?
Yes. Well, that's it. Breast cancer prevention. Breast Cancer Prevention Institute. Dr. Angela Lanfranchi still runs that website. We got lots and lots and lots of great information.
Yeah,
It's
I've got some brochures here.
Right. The BCP is to us, BCP means breast cancer prevention, not birth control
I think
pills.
that's on here.
BCPinstitute.org. www.bcpinstitute.org.
And I really want to encourage my listeners and my viewers that get informed. Don't trust mainstream scientist research. Not saying they're all bad.
Just think Fauci,
Yeah, just think Dr. Fauci. Just
He's
think
just
the
as dishonest as
FDA.
the rest of them.
Yeah. And do your due diligence in researching for your own health's sake.
Yeah. Yeah, but
And to
I
get
should say
informed.
it's not that there aren't scientists that work for the National Institutes of Health and the government and so on, but they are very few and far between, because those who are, honest and competent and all of that and willing to speak up, they get forced out, they get pushed out. They either toe the line or they lose their careers.
Right. Yes.
That's how it works. So I never depended upon them. I was very fortunate, and that the good Lord put me in a good position to, to do His work and get His word out, but not good enough to do what at least I had envisioned, to make this really well known by everybody that abortion increases the risk of breast cancer. Because now everybody thinks it's not true, but
well, it's only common sense. I'm a very common sense.
I know, yeah, but it's also it's not to be discouraged. I mean, there have been many, 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 many women and children saved by our work in exposing this link.
Yes.
And you can't, sort of like, like Jesus, you can be the sower of seeds, right? You sow seeds, and some of them land on fertile ground, and some of them land by the wayside, and some in between. But that's all we can do, and that's what we're doing now. That's what I'm trying to do right now.
Yeah.
One of the seeds this conversation is provoking in me is I heard recently a comment about epigenetics and how we should be paying attention to the nutrition and the environmental factors of even the grandmother, because they affect the mother and they affect the grandchild.
Right.
And I asked the question, and the gentleman said there was no research, but what is the epigenetic effect of what you're talking about? The increased risk of breast cancer, would it have an increased risk then as time goes by? Because as I understand it, the eggs are present at the time of birth. Yeah.
Sure. That's I know. That's what I was wondering about mifepristone, that sort of thing. And we don't really know. There was some research done way back when the drug, what was the drug now? It was a drug that was used to prevent miscarriage.
Misoprostol? No, that wouldn't be it. Misoprostol would be
to prevent miscarriage.
The progesterone is something different.
Yeah, there was a drug that was known for many years, diethylstilbestrol, DES, that was given to women to prevent miscarriage. And they've noticed that even in the second generation, daughters of women who were prescribed diethylstilbestrol had a higher risk of breast cancer. So that kind of effect has been documented in that one well-known case, but I don't believe it has. I'd love to see it. I'd love to see mifepristone, the research done on mifepristone, although I hate the fact that there's now people to study who have mifepristone in their system. But then again, you've heard also it gets into the water, and especially birth control pills. They've been around a long time, poisoning the water for a long time. And we're seeing the effects now. But again, there's a lot of denial because birth control is so sacrosanct. It's so, oh no, what we do without birth control? Oh my goodness.
You do natural family planning. That's what you do, and it's not harmful to your body.
That's what we would do.
Yeah, that's right.
And abstain from having sex outside of marriage. Hey, that's
a possibility.
So, and we've talked about those subjects before. Well, Dr. Brind, thank you so much for coming on. I hate that we're out of time, but I do want to have you come back and talk a little bit more about birth control.
Anytime, we'll set it up. I'm happy to do it.
Well, thank you. And it's
sow more seeds.
Yes, amen. And that's the whole point, is we want to educate our viewers and our listeners. We want you to educate others. We want you to dive deeper and educate yourself even more. And we want to save lives. We want to save the lives of the mother. We want to save the lives of the baby. So that's why we have experts like Dr. Joel Brind come on and educate us on that. So thank you all for tuning in to more of the story.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Dr. Joel. And Mary, thank you for joining me. And we will see you all next time. Meantime, God bless you. Bye.
Bless you too.